Lindy Ryan here today to talk to Jim Potts, author of the upcoming true crime memoir, Defending a Serial Killer, The Right to Counsel, coming July from Vesuvian Books. In Right to Counsel, Jim gives a personal account of his time spent on the case of notorious serial killer Michael D. Matson, time which ultimately led to the overturning of Matson's conviction. So, Jim, I had the pleasure of editing Defending a Serial Killer, and I'm so excited to have the chance to do this interview with you and ask some of the questions I've had over the past few months. So, thank you so much for being here.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's talk about, I think, one of the biggest questions of the book. How did you become involved in such a high profile case when you were so early in your own law career?
Yeah, well, actually, it was a call from one of my law professors at that time, Ron Smith, who's mentioned in the book. Ron called me and asked me, he said, "Hey, listen, Jim, I've been appointed by Justice Rose Bird to handle a death penalty case in California. When you get the death penalty, it's an automatic appeal to the California Supreme Court." So Ron had been dealing with death penalty cases before. So this wasn't his first one. And he said, "Hey, listen, I got this case, been appointed by Justice Rose Bird. It's very, very comprehensive. I mean, there's a lot to it. Would you be interested in, working with me on it?" And of course, being a law student at the time, you jump at the opportunity for that kind of experience because that doesn't come along that often. And quite frankly, even in a career, it doesn't always come along. So yeah, I jumped on the opportunity and I liked Ron. Ron and I took a class from him, like Ron as a professor, and knew that I could also learn from him in this process as well. So it was a combination of those things. I jumped into it.
Hey, sounds like a great opportunity that, really paved the course of not just your career, but history as well. And it sounds like, you got this opportunity, jumped right in with both feet, and then kind of learned about the case, afterwards. So what was your initial reaction once you learned what the killer had done?
Well, I was repulsed, quite frankly. All right. And the reason why I say that is because, your excitement is there. You get the there was 4,000 pages of transcripts and exhibits, and you're going through this. And, I never asked Ron what he had done. And he was a self-confessed killer at that time as well. Now, that part I did know, but I didn't know what he had done, to be perfectly honest with you, because, again, this was an opportunity. So when I received the documents and I actually started going through the documents and the transcripts and things, and I learned, what he had done in terms of, having kidnapped, raped, sodomized, and murdered, 6 girls, I was totally repulsed. These are things you look at and you have to take a moment and sit back because that's not necessarily what what you expected. I mean, I knew you got the death penalty. You get the death penalty, you killed somebody. But when you look at it and say that here's a 9-year-old who he had, his first victim, which he had kidnapped, murdered, raped, and sodomized, I mean, the ordinary human being, in my opinion, would be kind of repulsed by that. My upbringing was very, very contrary, to what I was reading. I mean, I was an Eagle Scout, an altar boy, went to all Catholic schools. This guy was everything I wasn't, and I'm like, man, this is ridiculous.
I can only imagine. I mean, you were this bright, ambitious law student on your way to a promising career. You were starting your family at the time. How did taking on this case really cause effect on your family life? What was that like at home?
That's where, you had to start measuring your ethical responsibilities to your personal values. And, as you're married, you have to take into consideration things that your spouse may, agree with or disagree with. I mean, that's all part of marriage in and of itself. What complicated this, of course, is that she was pregnant with our first son. And it was like, okay, wait a second. Why would you want to help somebody like this? So, there was the rub at that point. I'm looking at it strictly from a law student standpoint of getting involved with this. And yes, I wasn't repulsed by it, but I had also given Ron my word that I would actually look into this, and be able to assist him. And it's not like that was from day one. I mean, I had to start reading the materials. So at that point, I had read the materials and had a discussion about what I had learned. And that's where, some opposition presented itself to why would you work on something that would put somebody like this back on the street? So that became really an issue because I had to decide whether or not I was going to stay involved with this, or get out of it. And that's where your ethical responsibilities to represent a client to the best of your ability, no matter what they had done, okay, or admitted to doing, not admitted to doing, because of the judicial system. The judicial system is one that I don't want to say excuses behavior sometimes, but some people would probably say that. But you have to look at the facts and make sure that the rights of the individual, in this case, Manson, were protected. And again, that's where the rub becomes, because what about the victim's rights? And you have to kind of go through all of that back and forth and then be able to make a determination as to whether or not you're going to be totally involved. And I will mention something else. The Code of Professional Responsibility also says that you just can't get out of a case just because you find the facts repulsive or repugnant. I mean, it's not just that easy, from that perspective. So I had to take all of those things into consideration. And, it became very trying at times, for the lack of support at home, because it's very intensive, as you can imagine, with the hours and hours of reading and research that you have to do.
And you were under an incredible amount of pressure at the time. You're dealing with your values, your ethics, those of the case, those of you personally and professionally. I mean, that's a major, life experience to go through all at one time when you're navigating all of those different components of kind of this experience. So after it's all said and done, how do you think that you were changed as a result of working on the Madsen case?
I'll tell you, what it did is set in stone for me about my professional outlook. When you get involved in any profession, not just necessarily this profession, but when you get in any profession, to me, you always have to do it to the best of your ability. And one thing that I did learn is that, you know what? 1 + 1 is always going to be 2. It has to be black and white, especially when you're dealing with the law. Some people argue gray areas, but the reality is that you've got to set a certain ethical standard for yourself professionally. And I don't care what profession it is, you've got to stick with that. You apply your values to it and you move forward. I mean, I go through this with clients all the time, and I talk to them about emotions, because sometimes they make decisions based upon emotions and, not, a proper thought out business decision. And to me, emotions have to be left out of this, especially in the judicial system. And right now, even as a nation, we're so confronted with some of these things that are happening that people, but they still don't understand the ramifications of failing with that judicial system. And they fail because of the emotions. Hang them, hang them, hang them. Give them, the gas chamber. Give them, execute them. First degree murder, without sitting back and saying, okay, people, leave the emotion out of it. Let's go through the facts so you understand fully what the facts are before we start making statements like that. So for me, it changed me professionally and gave me an outlook that I'm always going to keep my moral values, my sense of values, and my ethical responsibilities at the highest limits. And that's the way, to me, you have to proceed. And again, I will emphasize that's any profession that you may be in.
One of the things you talk about in the kind of toward the end of the book is that you start to draw some parallels between what happened in the situation with Madsen that ultimately overturned the conviction, and then also parallels with more recent kind of top of mind cases like the Scott Peterson case, the Boston marathon bombing case. How do you see, or how have you seen maybe history repeat itself from some of those things that happened in the Madsen case to what cases happening today?
Well, all of those cases are based on emotions, first of all. Okay. And again, right now, as I talked about with Scott Peterson is up on an appeal right now. All right. There's an appeal that's going on. And again, you look at these and you say, okay, why is it an appeal? Was there a mistake with the jury? People will always talk about the emotional part of this. Look at what's going on possibly in the George Floyd conviction, where now there might have been an issue about somebody in the jury having seen something, said something. See, this again shows you that this is not a new issue. The emotional issue when you deal with your judicial system is always going to be there. And it's hard for people because they just look at it from the plain facts that this is what it was. I don't like what happened, and end of story. Police officers can't afford to act emotionally about things. When I talked to Pat Dingle, Pat was very emotional about this right from the outset. When he had learned about what Matson had done, et cetera, did not want this man back out on the street. And he told me, quite frankly, that he had, not told the truth about some of the admonishments that he had given Matson, which is the right to remain silent, et cetera. And that was all based on emotion. So these things, when police officers engage a suspect, it's almost like you have to walk that person by the hand politely through the judicial system. The moment you step outside of that, you are not going to be able to have this thing handled the right way. And then the rights of the victim and their families become penalized as a result of those emotional reactions. And not all these things are the same that you're talking about. They're all the same.
And that's another thing you touched on in the book. And I think it's absolutely astute, right? When we, you take a kind of a normal outside perspective, when you hear about something someone has done that's so atrocious, like, right? Raping, kidnapping, murdering a child, or, murdering a pregnant woman, or, these other things that have happened, there's this visceral response that we have as humans to these horrible tragedies. But investigators, law enforcement, legal counsel doesn't really have the privilege, kind of as you point out, of having that emotional response. Like, to think about ethics and rights and constitutional, foundations to be able to pursue, to make sure that the person who committed the crimes and the victims of their crimes, receive justice, and the emotions can get in the way of that. Is that?
It's not the police officer's job to make decisions in terms of who's innocent and who's guilty. When I worked street patrol, as an example, I arrested people that later on I saw, because I also patrolled the same neighborhood I worked in, and which means that you've arrested people, that you might run into in your neighborhood. And that happened a couple of times. And, every one of them have told me, you know what, when you arrested me, you may not even remember you arrested me, but the way that you treated me was with respect. And I appreciated that, because when I had to make an arrest, I always told people, when it was a warrant that came back on the individual, look, I don't know whether you did it or didn't do it, and it's not my job to judge you. My job is merely to bring you into a system where, if you didn't do it, to give you a chance to be able to vindicate yourself, et cetera. That's the way the judicial system is supposed to work. And you cannot tramp on people's constitutional rights. And when you do that, you're not going to, the victims are the ones, and society as a whole, quite frankly, is the one that's going to ultimately pay that price. Now, where I ran into my dilemma was that when I actually found that Matson, rights had been violated, as an example, now I'm in a situation where I wasn't crazy about moving forward with it, but told myself this is something I needed to do professionally. Now, on top of it, I then find out that there was a mistake that the police officers had made, and that his rights may have been violated. So now I had to go back and tell my wife at that time that I may have found, the issue that might reverse the conviction. So then again, you get into this turmoil with that. And then I went to Ron and told Ron that I found something. And at first, Ron didn't buy into it. It took me, time to convince Ron that this, in fact, might be an issue here. And he finally just said, okay, I'll include your argument in the brief to the California Supreme Court. So, again, you go through this emotional turmoil with these things. I mean, I don't like Matson. Did I want him back out on the streets? No. But what was my professional responsibility toward representing a client to the best of my ability? That's what I was getting into. That was the profession I was entering. So therefore, I had to do it.
Yeah. And as I recall from the book, your wife at the time, Betty, did not share that opinion at all.
Right. That's correct. No doubt about it. I don't fault how people feel and their own feelings about things like that, but that's exactly why. And one of the reasons, by the way, that I decided to write the book, because when you get caught up in this emotional trauma, we just have to understand the emotions have to be left out of the judicial system, as an example. Again, the rights of the victim, and not just the victims, because the victim, often is gone. But what about the emotional trauma to the family as well? I mean, you watch some of these cases. I mean, even like the O.J. Simpson case, as an example, the family, of the murder victims in his situation. I know he was found innocent in that. But look at the family to this day that speak out. The Brown family, as an example, that speak out still to this day about the trauma that they suffered as a result of their loved ones being murdered. as an example. So it's more than just the victim. Okay. It's the victim's family and friends that also are impacted by poor decisions.
Absolutely. And that was, in fact, was my next question was, why did you decide to write about the experience? And I think you've kind of answered that question, being able to give those other people some voice and some closure, because a case ends doesn't mean that the event is over for these families and these survivors.
And that's right. But let me just, expand on that a little bit, because the other reason for writing the book is that I wanted to reach a certain targeted audience. So when you say a targeted audience, Jim, what kind of targeted audience are you talking about? Well, listen, I'm talking about parents, okay, because there's a lesson to be learned. A lot of those girls that Mattson was able to capture, kill, etc., was because they were hitchhiking. And what's the message that we tell people? Don't get in the car. Even the 9-year-old, she wasn't hitchhiking, but he capitalized on her emotional issue that she was going through at that time with her sister. And she got into the car with him because he said he'd take her home. The message to parents is, hey, listen, make sure that you really do have your kids understand, do not get into the car with strangers. Then you look at law enforcement. What do you want to tell law enforcement by this book? I want to tell them, look, you have to understand, leave your emotions out of it. Make sure that you do everything that you're supposed to do as a police officer, and stay within the guidelines of the constitutional requirements that are out there, that when you confront the suspect. Law students, as an example, this is a great book for law students as well. Why? Because they have an opportunity to learn what they may be confronted with at one time themselves, and about their ethical responsibilities of representing a client, no matter what kind of emotional pushback they may be getting from loved ones, etc. So it's an excellent one for that as well. And then for attorneys, to make sure, once again, that this is a situation where you have to always represent a client to the best of your ability. And, you move through with, getting the best job that you can, and leaving the emotional part, out of it. And then finally, I want to reach out to potential jurors. Now, that may sound funny, but when you really think about it, come on, some of this is guided by jurists. How many times have we heard about cases, we may not know, but cases get reversed because jurors have done something they weren't supposed to do. They talked to somebody outside the jury room when they were sequestered. They're not supposed to do this. They're not supposed to, look at TV. They're not supposed to do these different things. And they bring those emotions back into the room. And then ultimately with a decision that later on you find out, oh yeah, this person, said such and such, or they talked to such and such. And now all of a sudden a, conviction is overturned on an appeal because they didn't do what they were supposed to do. So I want to reach out to all of those people, quite frankly, that they understand, leave the emotions out.
Absolutely. I mean, this book is more than a true crime story or a memoir. It's a cautionary tale. And to all these audiences you mentioned, to law students, to jurors, to law enforcement, to parents, to women, I'm reading it as a woman and a mom, and there's lessons in there, even for me to think about. And you really reshaped the way that even I thought about things. So I think you have a lot to tell a lot of different audiences, and there's a lot to glean from the information you presented and the way you've shared your story to really connect, that personal journey to what was going on at the time. Now, you mentioned talking to Detective Pat Dingle, and for those of who may not know, Pat Dingle was a lead investigator on the case who has since passed away. How do you think he might respond to this book, or what his thoughts might be?
Oh, I already know the answer to that question. He was very, it was funny when I talked to Pat. Pat didn't know. He knew that the conviction had been overturned, but he didn't know why, really. All right. So in terms of me talking to him about the book, he was excited. From his perspective, the only thing he cared about was that he did what he could in order to put Mattson behind bars, and he did capture that for whatever amount of time it was. So from his standpoint, he was excited about it, and then again, he admitted to me about things that he had done. And now, as you said, he's passed away, and there's things that I had kept confidential that I was not able to be able to express, at one time, but now I can do it freely. So that's the exciting part of it, to give the full story.
Absolutely. You share the kind of full circle of this story with everyone involved. So as we close, is there a specific moral lesson you would like your readers kind of all inclusively to take away from this book?
There is, but I want to make one more comment, because you also asked me how Mattson would view the book.
I did. Yeah.
Yeah. Mattson, when I reached out to him initially, he did not want to discuss. He did not want to discuss it, and he had an attorney that would not let me discuss anything with him as well. So how would he have viewed it? He was egotistical enough, probably, to have that information out there, where his ego, in my opinion, he probably would have been somewhat flattered, unfortunately.
And Madsen has also since passed away. Is that
That's
correct?
correct. That's correct. Now, when you say what I want people to take away with from a moral standpoint, it's not just a moral standpoint, in my opinion, it's a value standpoint that we have to understand. And that is that we have these values. Our parents have taught us some of these values. Sometimes we learn values through hard mistakes. But what I want them to take away from this book is that, look, when you have those standards, don't let those standards down, no matter what pressure is being exerted around you. You stick with your standards. For people in the professional business, stick with your professional ethics, and don't be, persuaded by, outside pressures to do something that's not within your heart to do.
And that, I think, is the best lesson of the book, right? Stick to your standards, don't back down. So, Jim, are there any other big cases that you've been on that maybe you'll be writing about in the future?
No, there's no, you know what? I don't, no, there's nothing on the horizon. I am writing some other books. I got another book that I'm writing on right now that I'm excited about. But this is the time necessarily to discuss that, but no big cases. And actually, my agent will probably tell you that there is one case, but it's an historical case, and that I've written on, and that's still kind of pending. So we'll let that go, okay? But there is another one that was very important, historically speaking. We'll let it go.
Well, maybe we'll look forward to hearing about it one day. But in the meantime, Defending a Serial Killer, The Right to Counsel comes from Vesuvian Books, July. So just a few weeks away, and you'll be able to get your hands on that one. A fantastic exploration of true crime, true events, and a person's journey through navigating the ethics and morality of such a landmark case. So, Jim, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes to talk to me. It was been wonderful.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
All right.